those who are unfamiliar, my name is Lachlan Anderson. I'm the president of the University of Sydney Philosophy Society, and I would like to begin tonight's event by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, upon whose land we are currently seated. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I'm thrilled that we are gathered here today to engage with a thinker who I have, in the lead up to this event, repeatedly described as a renowned philosopher and prolific author. My repeated use of these two labels is owed to my sincere belief in their accuracy. Professor Grayling has, according to the undoubtedly laudable resource that is Wikipedia, written, quote, about 30 books on philosophy, biography, history of ideas, human rights, and ethics. As someone who has recently fought incredibly hard to submit a single honours thesis and 2 essays, I find such an output completely mind-boggling. I first encountered Professor Grayling's work in my final year of high school, when a desire to write an absurdist play about atheism led me to borrow his book, The God Argument, as part of a stack of many others from my local library. More recently, I stumbled upon his voice this year when listening to the BBC's In Our Time podcast on John Stuart Mill as part of the research process for my honours thesis. As such, I am currently fighting the temptation to convert this whole event into a very specific discussion of Mill's views on free expression and his so-called harm principle. However, I will respect my responsibilities as president and put the needs of the many members who are not as enthusiastic about Mill before my own. I'm also currently making my way through Professor Grayling's History of Philosophy as a way to gain some idea of how the many areas of philosophy that my now sadly completed major did not afford me the opportunity to become acquainted with. In short, I'm immensely excited to be sitting across from him. I kindly request that we all show our appreciation for Professor Grayling's attendance here this evening and welcome him with a round of applause. Now, the issue with having a guest who has written so much about so many different topics is that it's difficult to find something to focus on or to begin with. Fortunately, though, Professor Grayling has had a fair bit to say about philosophy in general, especially in terms of the many forms that it may take, from a specific academic specialization to an individual contemplation and pursuit of the good life that anyone may undertake. As such, I would like to begin tonight's question and answer by asking you, Professor Grayling, what makes philosophy special or unique to you, and what convinced you to dedicate so much of your life to the discipline?
First, may I say thank you very much indeed for your hospitality here, all the more so because actually I invited myself. So it's very kind of you indeed to accept the self-invitation. And it's lovely to come here and have an opportunity to meet you. Right, but I got interested in philosophy very early. In fact, I was my parents were Brits, but my father was working in Central Africa, which is where I spent my childhood and part of my teens. And in Central Africa, I mean, even more so than here in Australia, and I was bitten by a redback yesterday, so I'm kind of conscious of the risks and what have you. But in fact, they're even greater out there. You can't go for country walks because you get eaten by lions and things. So you're sort of thrown on, well, the adults, I suppose, on drink and adultery, but children, you just have reading is the resource. So I used to read a lot, and we had a big set of encyclopedia at home in which there were articles about Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, accompanied by very fine pictures of all three. Socrates with his snub nose and Aristotle with his wonderful beard. And I was really, really curious. I really wanted to find out about them, try to make sense of the entries in the encyclopedia. And finally, when I managed to get a ticket to the sort of adult part of the library in that part of Africa was really very curious because, of course, a lot of people had gone out to run the empire and died of tropical diseases, leaving their university books to the library because their relatives back in the UK didn't want them shipped over. So there was an entire set of Plato's dialogues in the Jowett translation, complete works. And I took down the first volume, fell open at the Charmides. You may remember that's the one about continents. It begins with a little story about Socrates coming back from the Battle of Ptolemy, and he asks everybody, who's the sort of the cynosure of every eye, and they'll say, oh, Charmides, he's so gorgeous and he's so clever and everything. Socrates says, oh, I'd like to go and see him. So they go to the gymnasium, sees all the boys there, and he says, call him over, because I'd like to know whether he has something which is greater than physical beauty, and that is a noble soul. And they discuss the question of continence. And it's a very, very accessible dialogue. I mean, I was 12 when I read it. I'm completely bowled over by the fact that these great iconic figures of our civilization could have dedicated their lives to discussing those questions. And I thought, that's what I'm going to do. And I did, because very soon afterwards I discovered that philosophy, which really, literally it means love of wisdom, which we all know, we all love wisdom. But literally, effectively, it means inquiry. It means disciplined, thoughtful, searching inquiry. And as soon as you become interested in philosophy, as you all know here, it gives you a license to stick your nose into everything. You can be interested in everything, because everything feeds into philosophical reflections, and that's absolutely wonderful. So you can read literature. Literature is a marvelous set of windows into the possibilities of life and experience. You know, we all love gossip. Literature is the higher gossip. So there you can, we've got lots of stories about love affairs and disasters and happiness and so forth. History, of course, because history is the great budget of human experience. Science, because that is our most successful epistemology, the inquiry into the structure and properties of the world. But then, of course, the fact that all our inquiries begin and end with puzzles, with difficulties, with unclarities, with concepts whose boundaries are fuzzy, concepts which can be misapplied, and when they are, of course, create all sorts of difficulties. And these are the concepts across metaphysics, epistemology, political philosophy, ethics, and all the special philosophical pursuits, philosophy of psychology, philosophy of science, and so on. So the minute that you find this out, of course, you've got absolutely endless horizon of things to be fascinated by. And as soon as you're seduced by it, that's it forever. You're a philosopher.
I definitely agree with the final bit. However, your intro as to how you got into it is far more interesting than mine, which is just picking a major at university. So I note that in this book, your history of philosophy, right at the outset, you explicitly exclude theology from its pages. Now, this makes for a rather interesting bookend to our semester, because we began with a former Philsoc member, Matthew Sue, who's just gone off to complete his PhD in Cambridge, who started us off with a seminar on what is philosophy, and he offered different formulations for what philosophy could be. And the view he eventually defended was, quote, the handmaiden of faith, end quote. He's a big Thomist, a big fan of sort of using philosophy to try and understand the workings of God or what God has designed. And so you would undoubtedly, on your writings, take a very different view. And so I wanted to ask you, how would you describe the relationship between philosophy and religious faith? And would you say that one does philosophy better or just differently by avoiding religious presuppositions such as the idea that the universe has been designed?
Well, the short answer to the last bit of your question there is yes. But the reason for it is this. If you were to look at the great history of ideas in general, at the, our very earliest efforts, our ancestors' earliest efforts to make some sense of the universe around them would undoubtedly have begun by imputing to events in nature the one explanatory principle that they had available to themselves, that is their experience of agency. If I pick up a stone and I throw it into the pond, makes a splash, I caused that. So if there's thunder or lightning or the surging of the sea or the blowing of the wind, it's very natural to assume that there must be some agent involved in making it happen. So it's a very kind of early sort of causal explanation. Well, you can think, therefore, of very early supernaturalistic beliefs as not being supernaturalistic but naturalistic, as they were attempts to explain natural phenomena, and therefore as a kind of proto-science. And you can then also think that perhaps the effort to make contact with the agencies responsible for what happens in nature is a very early form of technology, because undoubtedly, dreams, fevers, hallucinations, eating fermented food without knowing that it was fermented and having a funny experience, made some people think that they could break through the barrier between this world and the world of those agencies, and therefore perhaps you could influence them or ask them for favors, or perhaps get them not to punish you with droughts and earthquakes and things. So you can see how it could be very early science and technology, and then as it developed, as people became much, much more at home in the universe. I mean, think, for example, if you look through the lens of mythology, every tree, every stream has its dryad and its nymph. Every major arena of natural events has its god. So Poseidon, god of the earthquake, and Zeus, the god of lightning, and so on. But as we got to know a bit more about the regularities of nature, the gods did two things. They became fewer in number, and they went higher up, mainly to mountaintops. That's where the Olympians were on Olympus, and that's where Moses met the burning bush version of God, which was the Mount Horeb. And then I suppose when people got to the top of mountains and there weren't very many gods, or even just a few, they'd kind of gone off into space. And when you stop thinking if the earth is flat, then heaven isn't up anywhere. So then it's very natural to think that they've gone out of space and time altogether. And that has been the trajectory over time of the sort of location, the habitation of the gods, and it's made a difference to questions of how we relate to them. So the increasing understanding and control over aspects of nature exerted by human beings meant that religious beliefs came to be less explanatory, except in the most general sense, how the universe began and what will happen to us when we end. But otherwise, we have control over nature. We are, as it were, subordinate agents in nature. It says in the Old Testament, doesn't it, that we've been given, well, Adam was given control over nature and named the animals, and they were for his use and so forth. So you can see how religion transmuted eventually into something very late on in the young religions of the world, Christianity and Islam, about 1500, sort of 1600 years old, and they have become religions of morality. No longer so much religions of explanation, except in those ultimate senses. But if you think of the very word religion, the classicists among you will recognize the etymology. Religio, religere, Latin, meaning to bind. The word religion has the same etymology as the word ligature, to tie. And in the Roman Empire, in the Hellenic and Roman periods, religion was a public affair, bringing together in an enormous empire, the Roman Empire, all the different ethnicities and languages and traditions and cultures into a single Roman imperium by worshipping the emperor or worshipping Jupiter. It's very interesting. You look at that word Jupiter, its etymology, Jew, same as Dieu, as in Zeus, Deus, Dieu, and Pita or Pater, Father God. So Jupiter is this major abstraction, and then the belief in that will be unifying. But there was no, sort of do's and don'ts and what have you, as there were, as there is in the Judaic tradition, which was very special and very local, very minority kind of religion. But that got incorporated in Christianity. And now the idea of religion is the idea of the moral life, the lived life. And it's no longer what it originally was, which was a kind of primitive science.
Just building on that idea, so there are undoubtedly many different reasons why people find religious faith appealing, either throughout human history, and you provided some examples there, or today. One of them, a bit of a more technical one, is the desire of a source of teleology in nature, to feel as though, and if people aren't familiar with teleology, just the idea of finding purposes in nature, to think that something that exists in the world exists for a purpose or has a particular function. And so that, for example, the telos of a knife could be to cut. The telos of a human heart could be to pump blood. And people find this very useful when they're talking about ethics, because you should say you should do things in accordance with the thing's function, or what is good for the thing in accordance with its function. And so if one denies that something has been consciously designed, and that it was instead just this sort of fictitious explanatory framework, does it still make sense to talk about things having purposes if they haven't been designed?
Indeed it does, and in a number of very interesting ways. Because again, if you look back across the landscape of thinking about ethics and morality, first let's just distinguish those terms, because ethics is not the same thing as morals. If you look at the etymologies of the terms, you see, very interesting. Ethics comes from ancient Greek ethos, which means character. And ethical reflection is reflection on the question, how should I live? What sort of person should I be? What values should shape my life? The word morals comes from a coining by Cicero. When Cicero was bringing some parts of the Greek philosophical debate into into the Latin conversation. He was looking for a term that would capture the sense of our obligations and duties to one another. And so he took the word mos, M-O-S, moris, plural mores, which we still use in English to mean customs and traditions, and really thought in terms of duties and obligations in our interpersonal relationships as being like a kind of etiquette, a sort of manners that we, how we behave towards one another. So morality is a much narrower thing than ethics. Of course, your morality is very likely to flow from your ethics in the sense that what kind of person you decide to be is going to say a lot about how you're going to treat other people. But for 1,000 years, from Socrates until 529, when the school of Athens was closed by, the Emperor Justinian, kicked all the philosophers out of Athens, for 1,000 years, ethical debate, not moral debate, but ethical debate, was entirely secular. I mean, Socrates, although he claimed that he had a voice which told him not to do certain things when he was about to do the wrong thing, but it never told him what positively to do. But he didn't say, and it's an astonishing fact, by the way, that Socrates and Confucius died 10 years before Socrates was born, and the Buddha in India, who either died or was born 10 years before Socrates was born. We don't quite know his dates. But all three of those great figures in those three great traditions were philosophers. They weren't preachers or prophets. They didn't claim that they'd had a revelation from a god, and they didn't claim that your choice of behavior was what would get you into a philosophic posthumous dispensation, into an afterlife some kind. They were philosophers. And therefore that, for the 1,000 years of our Western tradition, the idea of justifying the good and well-lived life, the flourishing life, had nothing whatever to do with religion. But in Christianity, you're taught that, and it's a very, very different conception, by the way, because in the Greek conception, think of Aristotle, and in fact you more or less are channeling in there where you talk about living according to virtue. He says, what is the most distinguishing thing about human beings? Well, the fact that we possess reason. Allegedly, we look at most newspapers and you wonder, but we have reason that distinguishes us from the animals. With them, we will eat, we will reproduce, but unlike them, we will think. And so we have this opportunity to accept what, in fact, was the Socratic challenge. Think, ask yourself, how should I live? Make your life your own. The considered life, he said, is the one that's really worth living. And that is a matter of reason, of identifying, achieving a certain degree of self-knowledge, but then identifying things worth doing. Nothing to do with the instructions of the gods or aiming to get into an afterlife. But the fundamental idea in Christianity, interestingly, is that we are born weak, we're born ill morally, we're born with a terrible inheritance, the inheritance of the fall of Adam and Eve. And we need salvation. We've got to be saved. And the way of doing that is to have faith, is to believe, and to give your will over. Thy will be done, not my will be done. The great sin in Christianity is pride. Think that you can stand on your own feet and think for yourself. And it's very interesting that idea, the idea of dependency, of weakness, and of needing to be saved, and all of us, we're all in the same boat. So unlike Socrates, who said, each of us has a responsibility to think for himself or herself about how to live. But Christianity tells us that if we will all just believe the same thing, then we'll all be okay. So one size fits all kind of model. And Islam means submission, submission to Allah. So both those young religions have a very different view, and they're very, incorporating in their attitude towards what salvation will be and what's required of us. And if you were a cynic, you would think, well, those sorts of ideas are incredibly useful to the people in charge of churches and religious organizations.
Thank you.
Only if you were a cynic.
Only a cynic, of course. I want to you just touched on there this idea of, moral debate has certainly been happening, independently of the idea of a divine authority or a divine lawgiver. However, when it comes to the idea of settling the score of that debate, or if there is someone who's right or wrong, I wanted to hone on this because it's a matter of personal interest and sort of as a way of paying homage to the University of Sydney, because throughout history, our university has had some very prominent atheist philosophers who have come in and they have looked at the world from their perspective. And they have seen that these kinds of, and I'll say moral facts, not ethical facts, because it's about rules of what you ought and ought not to do. So people like John Anderson and John Mackey, they look and they say, they're not there. So for them, I'm not saying that it necessarily needs to be that if you get rid of God, then the moral facts must go also. That's a separate discussion. But I will say, if we are not to turn to God as the divine lawgiver, if we want a way of settling this ethical debate, what should we turn to? Or do you think that kind of settling of the debate is sort of not unnecessary?
Well, let's distinguish two questions. Settling the debate about whether or not who or what the lawgiver is going to be, and secondly, that what becomes then the very interesting question, that if we are to be our own lawgivers, what would constrain or help or guide us in being such, in being autonomous ethically? Just before I answer that, I have to tell you that John Mackey, when he was at Oxford after he'd been professor at York University in England after leaving Australia, and then he came to Oxford and he was at University College, and he was one of the kindest of men. I mean, all of us, I was a graduate student at that time when he was there, and I had Peter Strawson, P.F. Strawson and A.J. Ayer as my supervisors. But when I had a few little problems, I would write a note to John Mackey and get screeds of paper back from him, because he was always so helpful and such a kind man. And I'm sure that has to do with he must have been bitten by something in Sydney. So the question is, are we going to be heteronomous or autonomous? That is, are we going to be make decisions about how we're to live and what we're to value, or are we to accept somebody else's idea or some tradition's idea about what that is? So let's fast forward right to a very distinctive and characteristic and indeed well-known view about an autonomous ethics, and that's the existentialist one. So the kind of bottom line of existentialism, and this is scooping up both the secular and religious traditions. In fact, you go all the way back to Pascal if you really want to look at the long roots of existentialism. People think about Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, and then they think about Heidegger, and then of course Sartre and Camus. In the later existentialists, and in particular in Sartre, you get the idea that once we have accepted the tremendous burden of our freedom, the fact that we are completely unconstrained and there isn't anything else out there, no handrails or anything, we are free and we have to choose, and every choice that we make is going to be consequential. And in his essay, Existentialism is a Humanism, he gives a very, very good application of the Kantian idea that your choices do have to respect what impact they would have on other people. And that is very, an interesting kind of view, invoking really the essential sociality of us as the kind of creature we are. We are essentially social creatures, and we need our relationships, and therefore we need to think about the impact on others. And then when you look at the outer bulwarks, if you like, of the existentialist view, which says that, well, we have the responsibility to choose and to act, and there are certain things like creativity, like love and friendship, like fostering human dignity. These are key existentialist values. That once one's recognized that, and one confronts the question of the ultimate, what is the ultimate basis? And the ultimate basis is in natural autonomy. You think of Camus, of course, called his version of existentialism absurdism, fallen out with Sartre over political matters. And in that famous essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, you know about the myth of Sisyphus, the guy's got to roll a stone up the hill, never ever going to get to the top. This is for all eternity. And Camus asked the question, can Sisyphus be happy? And his conclusion is that he can. Why? Because we can choose to infuse meaning into our existence. We can make our existence meaningful by our choices. And he ends that essay on something of an up note, having begun, you may remember, by saying, a great philosophical question is, should I or should I not commit suicide? Because if the answer is no, then it's because I've got a reason to live. And that reason is going to be important feature of our meaning.
And so if someone in that process of sort of autonomy, of defining for themselves what the good is or what they're going to do with their life, if they come to something that is completely antisocial and completely horrible, is there a principled way that we respond to that, or is it simply the pragmatic thing of, well, we all in our autonomous way dislike you, therefore we want you to stop and we're going to throw you in a cell?
No, there is a principled way, and it's provided by your friend and mine, by Mill, by the harm principle. Because just supposing you thought, right, I'm going to be very extensious now, I'm going to settle down here, I'm going to try to get some self-perception here. What are my talents and abilities and failings, and what might I be good at? And then you think about things that you might find satisfying, and you decide, I think I'll be a good murderer. Now, the point about that kind of choice is that you simply could not stand up a case to anybody else. Any mature-minded, sober-minded person, and by the way, each of us should be that mature-minded and sober-minded self-judge when we make decisions of this kind about how we're to live. But imagine trying to stand up a case. So you meet somebody you respect, somebody whose view and whose way of thinking you respect, and you say, right, I'm going to be a murderer. How could you stand up a case against that person? And the reason why you can't, of course, is the harm principle kind of reason. Now, the fact of the matter is, the matter of psychological fact is, I'm afraid we are going to harm other people by our choices. Every time we buy an airline ticket, we're harming somebody. We're going to upset people that we care about, members of our families and so on. So it's impossible to be harmless in life, but one can think very seriously about the kinds of harms that we ourselves are prepared to tolerate. Let me put the point this way. Supposing you are open to falling in love with somebody. Well, if you do fall in love with somebody and that person falls in love with you, then the two of you have entered into a contract for sorrow. Because one of you is going to die first, or one of you is going to fall out of love or have an affair, or something is going to go wrong. Okay? It's very rare when it doesn't, or when the two of you live together for 95 years and fall off the Sydney Harbour Bridge at the same moment, then it's fine. But in general, our relationship with other people is a contract for sorrow. And knowing that, however, is not a reason why we don't do it. And we exercise our choice and we take the risk of it because the risk is worthwhile. I mean, rather to love and then after 10 years or 50 years or something to experience the grief which you only feel because you loved somebody, rather than not have that experience at all, just be like a true Stoic, exercising what the Stoics called apatheia, which is indifference, so you don't make your own peace of mind contingent on anybody else. You only depend upon the things that you can control, the mastery over your emotions and your fears and appetites and so on. But the Stoics, in the purest version of Stoicism, would say, don't have friends and don't fall in love. You can't control what other people do. If you become dependent in any way, emotionally or in any other way on other people, you're going to suffer for it. But then the sort of existentialist answer is go for it, a bit of suffering. As the Dutch say, een beetje pain is fijn.
So it's dealer's choice then between suffering or protecting oneself. Well, I'd love to talk about Mill and meta-ethics for a couple more hours, but I'm going to move to a different topic just because we're strapped for time. So in the wake of the many, shall we say, interesting political developments of 2016, I believe you single out the election of Donald Trump and the successful Brexit vote in the United Kingdom. You wrote a book titled Democracy and Its Crisis. But if I'm just to quickly quote from the blurb of that book, it ends with the advent of authoritarian leaders and the simultaneous rise of populism, representative democracy appears to be caught between a rock and a hard place. Yet, it is this space that it must occupy if a civilized society that looks after its people is to flourish. Now, on a personal note, I was recently deeply disappointed by a democratic outcome here in Australia, the resounding failure of the referendum to establish an Indigenous voice to Parliament. And I was particularly struck about how so much of the debate surrounding that topic, regardless of one's stance on the issue, was filled with just patently misleading information, such that a bunch of law professors all across Australia wrote an open letter just to clarify the actual state of the law in our country that people were then voting on. And so so as a trained philosopher who is acutely aware of how developing a proper understanding of issues of politics and morality requires a great deal of care and dedication and time, what instills you with the hope, because it seems like a hopeful thesis at the end of that blurb, what instills you with the hope that general populations of democratic nations will be able to consider such issues and arrive at the right conclusions, or at the very least conclusions that are worth enacting into law?
Okay, so have we got breakfast organised? Just to try and dive right into this very quickly, and by the way, I was very, very interested in the whole process and the voice vote, and I was in Perth last week as a guest of one of the people who was a leader of the Yes campaign, and a lot of people there were kind of interesting in a way, because, you know, a lot of sort of wealthy individuals from Western Australia were very committed to getting a Yes vote, and were deeply, deeply, deeply disappointed, not least because the polls had been very positive right at the outset, you may remember, and then they plummeted on the basis of something which is really rather interesting about the way our democratic processes have been corroded, and that is that the no vote had only to sow doubt and uncertainty. Didn't have to make a case, didn't have to put forward an argument, just had to make people a bit worried. If you don't know, vote no, you know, that kind of thing. Very, very effective. And the Yes vote people had the responsibility of really explaining to people clearly exactly what the voice to Parliament would mean. And I know now, because I had the sort of interesting experience of having lunch with one of the Teal MPs in Perth, to talk about what the independents are trying to do to try to build in or bake in this phenomenon of having a kind of buffer in Canberra of independent MPs, which is possible in your electoral system just about, even though your electoral system tends on the whole to have a kind of binary tendency. But the idea that that is necessary is in fact a symptom of the thing that I was discussing in that book. And this is not a commercial or break or anything, but I should mention to you that after writing that book, Democracy in this Crisis, as is usual with people who are interested in philosophy, I thought, well, I would really actually like to dig a lot deeper into some of the things that I discussed in that book. And so I wrote another one, you know, why not? I wrote a book called The Good State, in order to discuss what constitutionality really means and how you should devise a constitutional order which would ensure that the really key thing. So the really key thing in our the kind of democracies which have developed in the last couple of centuries is this. You will remember from your reading of Plato, The Republic, Book 8, where he talks about all the different political systems. And the second to worst system is democracy. Why? Because if you put power into the hands of ignorant, short-termist, self-interested, highly local, prejudiced people, you know it's not going to be great. Okay, what you're going to get, says Plato, is anarchy very soon. And the anarchy is difficult to live with, and therefore, as soon as they've got very fed up with it, they will welcome a tyrant who will come in and restore order. In fact, we're just seeing this in our world. We look at the election in Argentina of this. Anyway, that's something polite to say about them. There's a sort of Trump-like figure in Argentina. But on the other hand, despite the fact that for more than 2,000 years, Plato's condemnation of democracy, thinking that democracy is nothing other than ochlocracy, that is, mob rule, it started to be discussed in the 17th century. Interestingly, if you look at the discussion in the English Civil War by the Levellers and the others, and the Putney debates famously, when the new model army asked for annual parliaments and representation for all adult males, men males of course, but then in that debate from John Locke really until Mill, our man Mill, in his book Representative Democracy, an idea was worked out. It was worked out by Locke and Montesquieu, Benjamin Constant, and Mill. I mean, all those thinkers in that period of 200 years. And the idea in question is the idea of representative democracy. The adjective is very key here. So the people have a right to a voice. As the people in the Putney debate said, any individual in the country should have a say in the formation of the laws under which he or she will live. So a right to a voice. But in order to avoid the ochlocratic outcome of the sort of anarchic tendencies of that, you have to respect another right, a right to good enough government. And this is something that Aristotle talks about, but it's insufficiently realized that Aristotle had because he was a very sort of common sense guy. He said, good enough government, a government that really works in the interests of all the members of the polis, that's a really, significant factor. So how do you get from the right to a voice to the right of good enough government, given the platonic risks of the voice? The answer is you build the institutions that will parlay the voice into good enough government. First, you have representatives. A representative is not a delegate, doesn't go just to say what the voters want. A representative goes to the legislature to get the facts, to discuss, to find out, to listen to argument, to come to a conclusion with others there, and to try to do what's in the very best interests of the people. This is the ideal. Okay? But as the franchise has extended all through the 19th and 20th centuries, and more people have been given the vote, so political parties have become more and more defined and more organized. In order to get a political agenda through with a very broad franchise and the ultimate influence of the voice on the government, you really do need to have a political party whipped and organized and disciplined. And the result, of course, as you see, firstly, that you don't get very nice people in politics, generally speaking. One of the reasons for it is that to get anywhere in politics, to get up the greasy pole in politics, your nose has got to be pretty firmly clasped between the buttocks of the person just above you, so you can be dragged up. And I mean, and that means you have to compromise, and you have to give up your principles, and you have to accept, that you're representing the party line and not necessarily your constituents or the interests of the country. This is what's happened, the sort of corruption of government by politics. So you only have to look at Prime Minister's questions, either in Canberra or in London, to see that they're constantly electioneering. It's government by politics. It's not government for the country or for the people, as much as it is government to stay in power, to retain power, and to win an argument. And all the arguments, of course, they're not dialectical in the sense that they're meant to arrive at some convergence on good policy or the truth, but they're heuristic. Heuristic is argument for the sake of argument. So if you're in opposition in Parliament and you want to do the government down, you've got to find their weak point and attack their Achilles heel and locate contradictions. And this is just heuristic. This is just argument for its own sake. And it's very corrosive. So too much politics into government means that government is bad. And therefore the constitutional order that we need is one that much, much more clearly defines the powers, the duties, the limits on what people can do if they're in elected or appointed office in government, and also very, very, very clear as to what government exists for. And if you think about it, it is for the good of the people or for the good of the country, and not for the good of the Liberal Party or the Labour Party or the Greens and so on. It's not the party. And I end on this point because I have a sense I'm going on too long. If you read Madison, the 10th Federalist paper, you get Mr. Google gives you that free if you look for a PDF of that. The 10th Federalist paper on factionalism, where he identifies this toxic problem of party politics and the way that it corrupts government. And look at the United States of America. I mean, the division between the Democrats and the Republicans is so bitter, and they are so far apart politically that they are prepared, especially the GOP is, Republicans are prepared to paralyze the country without a budget and everything else to score political points. It's appalling.
Thank you, and I like that we're sort of leaving it on a Socratic note there, and that we've pointed out everything that's wrong with politics and our democracy. We'll fix it another day with another couple of hours. Before I turn over to the audience, I just wanted to ask a very short and simple question, just so people have something to sort of like take home with them, which is, Just, do you have any recommendations of a philosophical text, thinker or theory that you think ought to receive more attention, that perhaps isn't sort of a mainstream part of philosophy syllabuses? And then second, a classic philosophy text, but that is really worth reading in the original. I know all of them are, but one that perhaps is really worth reading its original rather than simply just hearing about it in lectures or secondary literature.
Oh dear. Okay.
No pressure.
Yeah. But generally speaking, beauty contest type questions. You know, who's your favourite philosopher? What's your favourite piece of music and so on. And I think that Parnassus, the mountain of achievement, is a huge plateau, not a peak. So you get plenty of people and names and books and things like that. So it's hard to say. Neglected text, which is neglected. That's really rather interesting. I think actually, I think the writings of Cicero. So you will see probably that a lot of people think that Cicero is a popularizer of philosophy and wasn't really such a great original thinker or anything. Actually, the Tusculan Disputations and the writings on old age and on duties and on the gods, I mean, or on the paradoxes of the Stoics, that they're very, very, very interesting works for a variety of reasons. One is they're a great window into Hellenic and Roman thinking, very, very good backdrop to the moment in Roman history when the Stoics were incredibly influential, you know, on either side of the empire, and all up through the reign of Nero, when there was, you know, the Stoics were in fact banned, and because Nero was fed up with them moralizing at him. So, you know, that's a very interesting period in thought, because it is thought applied, it is thought at work in society, in politics, and in life, in a very distinctive way. So I would recommend people to have a look at Cicero and understand why Erasmus, now Erasmus in the early 16th century was a huge, he was the Elvis Presley of his day. I mean, he was widely read and widely admired and a huge influence on the Renaissance. An important figure because he was a kind of irenic figure, given that he had straddled the period of the beginning of the Reformation. And he said, Cicero, had he lived in the Christian era, would have been called Saint Cicero, because his writings on things like old age, De Senectute, is a beautiful, beautiful piece of applied philosophy. And Hume said that he wished that he'd been given Cicero to read as a boy and not, you know, the Catechism of the Church of Scotland, you know, which was written kind of like that. So he said, oh, if only I'd been given Cicero to read, it would have been so much better. So Cicero, that would be my choice, and I've mentioned some books.
Yeah. And he is both under one that you recommend reading in the original and one who's underappreciated. So two birds. So we'll now take questions from the audience. People can just raise their hands. But first of all, just going to give a quick round of applause for that section.
Just before we take any questions, can I just say, I mean, this sounds incredibly sort of woke remark, but I don't care if it is or not. There is empirical research which says that if the first person to ask a question in a meeting like this is a woman, then more women will ask questions in the meeting. So, anybody got a question? No.
Dan, deliver the microphone.
Shall be the microphone bearer.
Oh, thank you.
So I'll need to see some hands to be directed.
You have a very brave lady. Oh, there you go. Thank you so much. That's
I guess I just wanted to ask about you personally and what you have most enjoyed about working in philosophy and some tips for young philosophers about academia and working in philosophy.
Well, you know, it is so absorbing that one forgets oneself entirely. You get lost in the ideas and in the work, and it's just wonderful. It always feels like, you know, feels like you've been out in the surf in Bondi or something when you come up out of, you know, a bit of work, because you feel very refreshed and exercised, and it's just a wonderful experience. For the first couple of decades after I finished my postgraduate work, I did a lot of technical work in philosophy and wrote philosophical papers there's an inverse relationship between the length of the words in a philosophical text and the number of people who read that text. So you don't get very much feedback from that. And just around about the turn of the century, I happened to be invited to write a biography of somebody I am quite fond of as a writer, William Hazlitt, the essayist, who in my opinion is the best essayist in the English language, although he is a bit of an acquired taste, admittedly. But if you read his essay on a landscape by Poussin, you get the point of what brilliant mind is at work in that essay, and what a really fabulous essay it is. Anyway, he was himself a philosopher. All his early work was in philosophy. He edited one philosophical work. He wrote a book of philosophy, Principles of Human Action, which is quite, as he himself described it, a metaphysical choke pear. And then he gave a set of lectures on the history of philosophy in England, and actually is responsible for having identified how much in Locke was plagiarized from Hobbes, who Locke doesn't mention, because Hobbes was regarded as an atheist in those days. It was bad, it used to be one, so people didn't mention. But then he decided that since very, very few people were reading it, that what he would do is he would smuggle his philosophical ideas into more popular essays. And right about that time, I started writing a column for the Guardian newspaper, and I thought, that's a great idea. I'll smuggle a few ideas in there. And so I started to write for a more general audience, thinking that since we have the privilege of being able to read and think and study, we really ought to try and share it if we can with a wider public. Some philosophical ideas and ways of thinking would do well. Not that we are in the business of telling people what to think, but providing materials for their own thinking. So I've done a lot of that, although just recently I've gone, again, writing the history of philosophy, and a book just published this year called Philosophy and Life, which is about the classical schools of ethics and about the modern way of making use of those ideas. Because actually, if you think about it, there are lots of very beautiful insights and a lot of depth and what have you in the Epicureans and the Stoics and the Cynics and Aristotle's work. But what they mainly seek to achieve, with the exception of Aristotle, is what they call ataraxia, peace of mind. And peace of mind is a very passive, rather negative thing. You can make your own little Epicurean garden, as Candide and all his friends do at the end of Voltaire. Or you could be a really thoroughgoing Stoic and just not care. You see somebody being mulched up by a lawnmower and you think, oh well, not going to allow myself to be upset by that. Whereas we now, with a much more robust sense of creating meaning, taxi drivers in London say to me, what do you do? I say, I'm a professor of philosophy. I say, why, governor? What's the meaning of life? I'll say, well, I know the answer to that question, actually. Not because I found it, but because the philosophical tradition tells us. And the answer is, the meaning of your life is what you make it. And it might be very different from the meaning that anybody else makes of their lives, but there's an important duty there, the duty to create meaning in our lives. And that, of course, is not what the Stoics and Epicureans were saying. They were saying, live a life worth living, which is a peaceful life. Whereas what the existentialists are saying is, go for it, make some kind of meaning. Well, either is okay in a way, it depends on your choices, providing it's your own. That's the great secret of that. So I wanted to write about that, given that there are now quite a lot of books like How to Be a Stoic and read Marcus Aurelius, and then there are people who, I better not mention any names, will give you 12 rules for being Alain de Botton or something like that. And my worry about that is it's just so shallow that if people read that stuff, they think, what, is this philosophy? And then not get in the weeds and not dig into it a bit where there's some really interesting stuff. So I thought it would be good to do something a bit more in depth about that subject. So I did. There it is. So that book, Philosophy and Life. But I find that work on that is every bit as exhilarating and engaging and absorbing as much more technical stuff. So I've been working for a long time, more than two decades now, on a book which is now nearly finished, which is a very technical book in philosophy. The distinguishing mark of which, of course, is that it does have those long words, marmalade, corrugated iron. And in fact, I'm giving a talk about one chapter in it tomorrow, which is what I'll send you at the faculty seminar here. And that kind of work, well, when you get into that very detailed work in philosophy, it's like having the barnacles scraped off the bottom of your intellectual boat. I mean, you really do feel so sort of shrived after a day of working on that stuff. I love it. I just love the intellectual engagement of it. And it's kind of important in a way, because we'd like to make a little bit of, if we could just put another little pixel into the understanding that we have of ourselves and our world, that would be really something.
Thank you.
Yes.
Andreas with the hand.
Yes, yes, fire away. Sorry, these answers are being too long.
No, that's fine.
Thank you, Professor Grayling, for coming and giving this wonderful talk. I was just gonna point out that Lockie and I, we both agree on one thing, and that's liking John Stuart Mill. Since we started talking about misinformation and campaigns that, like, they give false information to people so that they dissuade and manipulate them in voting for the worst of society instead of for their good and for whatever special interest there might be involved. And since you also like John Stuart Mill, I would like your opinion on what are the limits of tolerance and free speech? Because I mean, I think in my personal take, I'm more tolerant than Lockie, because I would say that fascists and Nazis have a right of free speech. He doesn't. But I'm just curious to know what you think, or what do you think John Stuart Mill would think about that matter. So,
I think the bottom line on the free speech issue, which has now, of course, been hijacked by the political right and using it to beat up on the political left, and especially the sort of more extreme left with what the right would regard as ultra-wokist agenda, you know. But I think the bottom line on it is that the way to deal with ugly free speech, the fascist and Nazi and racist and sexist free speech, is to fight it with better free speech, is to have good arguments, organized thinking, and never to put up with it and to stand your ground against it, rather than to deny it or shut it up. Not least for the reason, and it's a purely strategic reason, is that you drive it underground, or you make it worse, or you kind of empower it by shutting it up. Whereas if you let them speak and they can display their absurdity and stupidity, and you can display it as well, then that's better. Having said that, it's terribly important to keep in mind the following two things. Without free speech, one cannot have politics. You can't put forward a proposal or challenge it. You can't have law. You can't accuse and defend. You can't have education. You can't transmit ideas and discuss them. You can't have art, creativity, literature, if there are lots of things you're not allowed to say. So free speech is absolutely fundamental to a good society and to being able to flourish in a good society. And at the same time, irresponsible use of it, the old thing, shouting fire in a crowded cinema when there is no fire, irresponsible use of it is dangerous and can cause really serious harm. And so my view is that we should have an absolute right to it, which we are enculturated to use responsibly. Now that sounds like a bit of a fig leaf. It actually brings us to the point about ethics, about authenticity, the idea that what you do, you're really authentically doing. What do I mean by that? Well, let me explain. So somebody's a vegetarian, you say to them, well, vegetarianism, still animals are harmed in producing vegetarian products, so they have lots of things to be a vegan. You say, okay, I agree with that, but the trouble is that being a vegan is quite hard work, and also I don't feel too good on it, so I'm just trying to do my moral best by being a vegetarian. I'm trying to save a few pigs and sheep and so forth. So at least I'm trying to do something. Now that could be a big fig leaf. You could be getting away with something, it just makes it sound easy. But if you really meant it authentically, and only you could know whether it was authentic, then that seems to me to be a legitimate argument. Now the same would apply with the free speech thing, that if authentically a person could be disciplined about when they make use of their right to free speech in the interests of, you know, social flourishing and other people and so on, and it was meant authentically, and it wasn't a disguise or in fact a result of being shut up by other people who say you're being irresponsible, then you can have absolute free speech, which is nevertheless a positive in society and doesn't have toxic effects.
I also just want to quickly clarify, because this is being recorded, I gave an emphatic nod when Andreas said that I am less tolerant than him insofar as I'm in favour of denying the free speech rights of Nazis and fascists. That is not my position. My position would take much longer to explain, but on the record, I'm not in favour of denying free speech rights based on political opinion, no matter how grotesque.
It's a future Prime Minister here who's just... Yes?
It's right, you can stay there.
Okay, great.
Thank you for coming and talking to us. I was really fascinated by your discussion of politics, and especially this idea of the erosion of democracy, and I like that you gave the examples of the US and the recent voice vote as ways of how fear and uncertainty can often sway people's opinions in matters that seem like a bit too big to let that kind of happen. I was wondering what your thoughts were about the role of education and philosophy in resolving some of like the political tensions that we see, especially now and across the world. Like what you think philosophy can do to try and help resolve some of those.
Oh, I think it could have a very, very big role if it were applied in the way that the use of information and fostering of debate works in what's sometimes called deliberative democracy. If you've heard of that process, where people are given information and then they're encouraged to treat the sort of interrelationship they're going to have with other people in a certain way by being prepared to listen and doing it respectfully, and then by being able to organize and articulate a certain point of view, then it turns out that the kinds of views that people might have had before they got involved in the process, a bit like being a member of a jury, they come out with a much sort of more mature conception of things, and indeed they have their minds changed by the process as well. Now, if one could generalize that sort of deliberative approach, and that would of course be doing philosophy by getting people to think things through and examine the concepts, look at the assumptions, ask where people are coming from, and you know what assumptions are shaping the way they see things. So if you could do that deliberative thing, which is exactly what philosophy is about, this deliberation, about thinking, then you could really enrich the public conversation a lot and make it a much more productive one. And this is something, schooling people into ways of thinking philosophically, thinking critically. You know, the phrase critical thinking is such a cliche these days, such a cliche that when people mention it, doesn't really mean anything to them, but it is so key, it is so central, and it almost seems to me that the only thing we should